Today on Slough School.
Hello, Claire, the Slough School Educator here at the Columbia Slough Watershed Council. And today on Slough School, we'll be learning about macroinvertebrates. More importantly, we'll be learning what they are insects and macroinvertebrates the same thing, what functional feeding groups are. We'll be creating a macroinvertebrate based on their functional feeding group, as well as comparing locations of where we can collect macroinvertebrates out in the field and see if they're different between being in a pond or being in a stream. So let's break down this word really quickly. Macroinvertebrate. So macro is the beginning of this word. Macro means big. Invertebrate means no spine. So I want to talk about some things before we get there. I want to look at the word macro and another prefix that is associated with it, micro. So when I think of micro as a microscope because we're looking at tiny little things under the microscope. When I think of the word macro, I think of macrofossils, also known as megafossils. And they're basically fossils of things that are large enough for us to see with our own eyes. So micro means so small you can't see it with your own eyes. Macro, it's big enough for us to see with our own eyes. So I want to break down the next part of this word, invertebrate. So we're going to have down vertebrate here. We're going to also bring in the word invertebrate. So every human, if you feel your back, you can feel your spine. So if you're a vertebrate or a human, you have a spine. Like so. If you're an invertebrate, that means that you don't have a spine. So basically, the meaning of this word, macroinvertebrates, is that they're big enough for us to see with our own eyes, but they have no spine. So some good examples of a few macroinvertebrates that I like to find out in the water specifically. There's water bugs. Some beetles are an example. Caddisflies. Snails are an example of macroinvertebrate because they have no spine. Crawdads or crayfish or crawfish are an example of macroinvertebrates. We also have a damselfly, which we're going to talk about more later. We have mayflies. We have a stonefly here. We have a water boatman. We have a dragonfly. We have a mite. We're going to have a beetle larvae. Worms are an example of macroinvertebrates. So these are all different types of macroinvertebrates. And later, we're going to be talking about what the difference between macroinvertebrate and insects are. But just for that definition, real quickly, macroinvertebrates are a living thing that's big enough for us to see with our eyes, and it has no spine. Now that we've talked a little bit about what macroinvertebrates are, and again, this definition that we're using is that they're a living thing that's big enough for us to see with our own eyes and has no spine, compared to an insect. So insects are a type of macroinvertebrate that has 3 body sections, a head, an abdomen, and a thorax, 6 legs, a pair of antennae. So we're going to talk a little bit about this definition of an insect. So here we have an ant, and here's the ant's head, here's its thorax, and here's its abdomen. It has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 legs. It has a pair of antennae, and it has compound eyes. So we have these 3 sections that it mentions up here in our definition. Our head again, our thorax, and our abdomen. So now we're going to determine if things are just macroinvertebrates or if they're also an insect, because insects are macroinvertebrates, but again, they have the 3 body sections, 6 legs, and a pair of antennae. So our first thing that we're going to look at here is we have a worm. So does a worm have 3 body sections? Nope, doesn't have any legs, doesn't have a pair of antennae. So we're going to put it over here in the macroinvertebrate category. I want us to look at this fly larvae. So it has a head, it has another section, but it doesn't have all the different sections. Does it have 6 legs? No, it just has the pair right there. It doesn't really have antennae. So this is also just a macroinvertebrate. I want us to look at this really cool creature. It's called a damselfly. And I want us to determine, is it a macroinvertebrate or is it an insect? So let's see. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 legs. And actually, I've kind of taken this apart so we can look at it better. So it has 6 legs. So that means it could be an insect. It needs 3 body sections. So here is its thorax, right here. We have its abdomen, right here in this little section. And we have its head. So all of these parts, these 3 sections, these 3 segments, make up our damselfly. So is our damselfly a macroinvertebrate and an insect, or just a macroinvertebrate? It's both. So I'm going to take this away. And we'll bring the damselfly over in the insect category. Another thing I want us to look at is a giant water bug. So it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 legs. It has a thorax. It has an abdomen, has a teeny tiny head. Again, I broke this down for us to look at. So we have the 6 legs. We have a thorax. We have an abdomen. And we have this teeny tiny little head on this big creature. So is our giant water bug a macroinvertebrate only, or is it also an insect? I'll give you a second to think about that. So this is actually an insect. It is both. So I'm going to bring it over into this category. If you like doing this activity, determining if things are just macroinvertebrates or also insects, we have a slideshow down in the description where you can go through a bunch of different photos of real-life macroinvertebrates and determine if they are just macroinvertebrates or if they're insects as well. So why are we talking about macroinvertebrates, and why are macroinvertebrates so important to the slough specifically and in general, just water quality? So macroinvertebrates tell us a lot. They tell us how much pollution could be in the water. If there are some macroinvertebrates who really, really like clean, cool water that's very clear, and you find them in your stream or in your pond, that lets you know that the water quality or the water is super, super healthy and there's a lot of animals that can live there. If there's macroinvertebrates who don't really care about the water quality, they can live in dirty water, it can be murky or mucky, and they don't really need cool water, then it tells us that maybe there's some issues with our water and that some other animals, like certain types of fish, couldn't live in that water. It also tells us if there's a mix of both, that we're doing okay with water quality and water standards, but maybe we need to make it a little bit healthier. And one of the cool things I really enjoy about macroinvertebrates specifically is that scientists use collecting macroinvertebrates to determine how healthy the water is, and if the projects, the restoration projects, them planting plants and doing other things to streams and ponds, is actually working or not. Because they'll collect a bunch of macroinvertebrates beforehand, and then they'll do their project, and then they'll look at the macroinvertebrates that live there afterwards for many years to see if it actually helped or if there's a change or not. With macroinvertebrates, there's things called life cycles. And life cycles are stages of growth that living things go through from the start of their life to the end of their life. Here is a photo of 2 different life cycles that macroinvertebrates go through. We have incomplete metamorphosis and we have complete metamorphosis. So an example of this, just briefly, with complete metamorphosis, they start off as something else and then they turn into that. So a good example that I like to think about is with caterpillars. Caterpillars are the larvae and then they turn into butterflies. Another example of this from the macroinvertebrate world of the water is we have beetle larvae. That's right here. So this is what they look like when they're larvae, and then they make a cocoon and they come out and they look like a beetle. So they look very different from the beginning of their life to their adult life. The other type of life cycle is incomplete metamorphosis, which has smaller nymphs before they turn into the adult. So an example of this are stoneflies. This is what a stonefly looks like as a nymph, right here. And then here's what it looks like as an adult. So basically, with incomplete metamorphosis, it starts off as eggs. There's this little creature and it just grows bigger and bigger until it turns into this. It doesn't have a cocoon or a pupa stage. It just goes directly from eggs to this and into this without making this little stop right here. Another big part of macroinvertebrates are something called functional feeding groups. And the definition that we use are how macroinvertebrates are grouped together based on what they eat and how they eat it. So there are 5 primary functional feeding groups. And for macroinvertebrates, our functional feeding groups, we have our grazers and scrapers. They scrape off algae from rocks. We have shredders. Shredders rip apart leaves and other vegetation. Vegetation is just a fancy word for other pieces of nature. We have collector and gatherers. They collect small pieces of dead things, plant pieces, and other small food pieces. So basically anything left over in the bottom part of the stream or the ponds, that's where you'll find that functional feeding group. We have filter feeders. Filter feeders filter water through them and eat anything that they find floating in the water. And lastly, we have one more. We have predators. And predators eat other macroinvertebrates. They either kill them and eat them, or they find the bodies and eat them. With this, I'm going to give you some examples of macroinvertebrates that are in these different functional feeding groups. So the first one I'm going to start off with is predators. I'm going to clean this off really quickly. So predators, they're animals that eat other macroinvertebrates that eat other macroinvertebrates. So some examples of some predators are the water beetle, dragonfly larvae, and water boatmen. So they have specialized mouthpieces that will allow them to tear apart and eat other hard things. So the next functional feeding group I want to talk about is the shredders. So for shredders, caddisflies and mayflies are 2 examples of shredders. However, caddisfly and mayfly, they tend to be able to adapt to whatever is available in the stream. So they might shred things. They also tend to be grazers and scrapers as well, which they scrape off algae from rocks. Another famous example that I like to think of with this are snails. Snails are really common grazers. Next, we have the collector and gatherers. So with these, they collect small pieces of dead things, plant pieces, and other small food pieces. Famously, crawdads are known as collector-gatherers, and as well as stoneflies. Lastly, we have our filter feeders. Our filter feeders, they filter the water, eating things that are floating in the water. Fly larvae tend to be filter feeders. Other things you can think of are freshwater mussels. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to create an insect. So using the definition of an insect and a functional feeding group, we'll create an insect. So it needs a head, thorax, abdomen, 6 legs, antenna, and a functional feeding group. Again, the definition of an insect is a macroinvertebrate that has 3 body sections, a head, abdomen, and thorax, 6 legs, and a pair of antennae. For our functional feeding groups, these are how macroinvertebrates are grouped together based on what they eat and how they eat it. So a brief reminder is we have collector-gatherers. They collect dead pieces of things, plants, and other food particles. We have predators, which eat other macroinvertebrates. We have grazers and scrapers. They scrape off algae from rocks. We have shredders. They rip apart leaves and other vegetation. And we have filter feeders. They filter water and things that are floating and eat the things that are floating in the water. So with this, today we'll be creating an insect. So the instructions for this is using the definition of an insect, a macroinvertebrate that has 3 body sections, a head, abdomen, and thorax, 6 legs, and a pair of antennae, as well as the functional feeding group. Our functional feeding group definition is how macroinvertebrates are grouped together based on what they eat and how they eat it. We will create an insect with those 2 things. So basically, we'll need a head, thorax, abdomen, 6 legs, antenna, and a functional feeding group. And again, these functional feeding groups, I'm going to put them down here really quickly. So we have predators, we have shredders, we have grazers and scrapers, we have collector and gatherers, and lastly, we have our itty-bitty baby filter feeders. So with this, you are going to pick a functional feeding group that you are going to then create your insect off of. So for me, I think filter feeders are pretty cool. So I'm going to choose that as mine, and I'll draw my insect for you. That is a filter feeder, and we'll come back together in a little bit. So I'm done drawing my little creation here. I haven't named it yet, but I'm going to name it... I don't know what I'm going to name it. That's fine. It doesn't need a name. You can name yours if you want. Oh, wait. I'm going to name mine Doug. Because I can. So here I have my insect that, using my instructions, the definition of an insect, and a functional feeding group. So to make sure that I got this functional feeding group right, I have these little tentacles, polyps, like little strings hanging out of its mouth so it can collect things and bring it back to its mouth so it can eat as the water flows through it. We have our abdomen here, our thorax here, and our head here. There's a pair of antennae, there's a mouth, and there's some eyes. So basically Doug just hangs out at the bottom of a pond or a stream and collects things in the water as the water goes over him, as it flows over Doug.